Hello and welcome to The Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to The Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome back Don Burnette, founder and CEO of Kodiak Robotics. Welcome back, Don.
It's great to be back.
It's great to have you here because over the last 18 months since you've been here, Kodiak keeps on trucking, and in the industry of autonomous trucking, a lot's changed. We saw the boom and bust cycle of SPACs, if you want to use the word, the implosion of SPACs, and during that cycle, I'm in my Bloomberg terminal. Okay, is Kodiak going public? Nope. Your attorney, Jordan, denies all claims, and you never took the SPAC money and run. You did it smart. How did you resist the temptation not to take the money and run?
It was quite tempting, I have to say. And there was a lot of fervor around that space, a lot of talk about it. Investors in various forms pushed companies like Kodiak into that direction. And we certainly looked at offers. So it wasn't for a lack of investigation per se. We had multiple SPAC offers, but at the end of the day, we felt like we just didn't have the metrics. We didn't have what it took to be a public company. You mentioned Jordan, our general counsel. One of the things that he really emphasized, and some of our board members really emphasized, is it's a whole different world to be public. And I think there were certain reasons that companies decided to go that route, but ultimately we felt like staying private was definitely what was going to position Kodiak for the most growth. And at the same time, we really hit our stride commercially, technically, and operationally. So it's been a good 18 months for us, not as good for certain other companies for sure.
It's a strength. You don't have the glowing pressure of the public markets. You don't have to deal with all the SEC filings, which can eat away at your cash reserves. And the thing that I don't understand, I'm an investor in the public markets and the private markets. How in the heck do you go public with no revenue? I say, okay, next quarter, no revenue. Following quarter, no revenue. How does a company go public with no revenue and then hope to survive?
Yeah, well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question. I'm not sure. We decided to take the different route. But that's precisely why we made the decision that we did. I think it was a opportunity to grab capital where capital was available at the time. And so I don't fault leadership teams, CEOs, founders for making that decision in the moment. But ultimately, the private markets are positioned to evaluate companies and technology like Kodiak's. It's not the public markets. Those investors just don't have the insight. The public investors don't have the insight. They can't come to your office, sit across the table, and go through your financials in excruciating detail and go through your technical presentation, have walkthroughs with your engineers. They just don't have that kind of access. And that's precisely what happens on the private side. So, yeah, I think the system is set up in a specific way, historically speaking, for different stages of a company. And you mentioned revenue in your question. I think revenue is a bare minimum that you want to have these days. And even then, now the scrutiny on public companies is becoming higher than just non-zero revenue. You have to have a path to profitability. You have to have a viable commercial path. And I think what you're seeing, not just within the AV market, but beyond the AV market, you're seeing a lot of blowback from companies that don't have any of the metrics that public investors want to see. And while I think there was some hype and excitement early on in the SPAC craze cycle, if you'll call it, that excitement, that hype, that fervor has essentially evaporated. And now companies are left with their fundamentals. And unfortunately, those fundamentals are not particularly strong.
I'm not being a Debbie Downer. The companies in the public markets are going to fail. They're going to get taken over or they're going to get delisted. It reminds me a lot of what you're doing with Kodiak by resisting the temptation of what Brian Chesky did at Airbnb. All these temptations, you have to IPO, and you would read public filings and statements from Mr. Chesky. Airbnb is not ready. I'm not ready to go. Today, Airbnb is public. They had a blowout quarter. Airbnb, I want to highlight, they're profitable. They're buying back stock. The board authorized a multi-billion-dollar stock buyback. And with the rising of interest rates, they're making money on the float. Now, that's the time, and he timed it perfectly to go public where it's a sustainable business, yet some of your peers in the industry, I said earlier, they took the money and run. Just follow the Brian Chesky Airbnb lesson there. And I want to add some context from, this is all publicly available data. I'm going to source it here to Bloomberg. There's 250 autonomous trucks registered today that's deploying over the course of time. But I want to compare and contrast that because there's 4 million Class 8 trucks in operation today. You got 250 autonomous trucks. You got 4 million Class 8 trucks. I'm an investor. You haven't even reached the first inning of potential growth there because you can eventually replace, say, 2 to 3 million of those trucks. Why did investors not ask these questions? Wait a second. You've got a long way to go to even becoming a sustainable business to catch up to the 4 million Class 8 trucks.
The question certainly is a good one. It's hard for me to put myself in the mind of a public investor that is supporting that opportunity, as you say, in the first inning. And I would argue it almost doesn't matter what inning you're in, right? Public investors should be looking for sound financials, fundamentals, product market fit, product revenue, profitability, path to profitability at the very minimum. So most of the companies that SPAC didn't have those fundamentals. And so you have to look at the whole mechanism of a SPAC and think, well, is that really what it's for? Now you've seen the SPAC market kind of come to a halt as a result of people questioning, well, maybe we should rethink this. Maybe there's a different way. But there are a lot of reasons why companies pushed to do it, and that was raise capital. So there were a lot of investors who wanted to deploy capital. I think there was a little bit of FOMO that drove the SPAC hype cycle, which is that public-only investors don't have access to this massive amount of wealth that's being generated in the private sector. That's been traditionally limited to the private-only investors. And so I understand the perspective of you think there's this company that is for sure going to survive and for sure going to make it, although how you make that determination is questionable. But let's assume that you've decided that this is an industry, it's going to be huge, it's going to be disruptive, like autonomous vehicles, like autonomous trucking, and you want to get in. This is your only opportunity. This is your only way to get in before the valuations are through the roof if they've gone through a traditional IPO. And a lot of investors, both professional investors and amateur investors, day traders, you name it, they saw this as an opportunity to get in early on companies that traditionally had been closed off to them. Let's call that an experiment. I think it's pretty clear that in retrospect, there's a reason why these two markets exist, why these two forms of diligence exist, why the scrutiny is different amongst the private companies and the public companies. As you said, there's a clear path and there's a clear set of milestones that you should be looking to hit and that investors should expect you to hit before you decide to go public. I think Uber is another great example. You mentioned Airbnb. I look at Uber. When I was there, I had conversations with Travis Kalanick, the founder, CEO. He basically said, we're not going to go public until my team comes at me with pitchforks, right? Because people want to exercise their options. They want liquidity. They want to actually make money. But Uber was private for many, 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 many years because Travis recognized the benefits of staying in the private markets. And I think there's a lot of wisdom that we can learn from the big companies, the companies that look more successful now in the public markets, who were startups in the mid-2000s, in the 10s, in the teens. There's an established model that companies like Kodiak should look to follow. And we'll see how it eventually ends up. It's not all bad or good yet. I think it's a little premature. It's not trending very well for most of the SPAC companies. I mean, some of them will be successful, but I definitely think that Kodiak's decision to stay private was the right one in the end.
It's totally the right one. It didn't damage your brand. I repeat, it didn't damage your brand. I recently bought a new car and I'm checking out, get the gentleman my credit card to pay for the car. And he said, what are you doing? I told him and he said, I invested in these companies. I'll leave him blank for now. I lost my shirt because I thought this was the future. And he said the same thing he said. He had the fear of missing out, but yet he put all this money into these companies. And unfortunately, the gentleman took a bath because he thought it was only one way up. But Wall Street bets, it only goes up. And then he learned the hard, cruel reality of markets go up and markets go down. But we mentioned the Airbnb example. You mentioned the Uber example with Mr. Kalanick. In order to stay private, you have to have financial discipline. How are you installing the financial discipline in Kodiak while allowing Andreas and your whole engineering technical team to build the Kodiak driver?
I think this question is much more broad than just Kodiak or just AV or what we've done. I think if you look around the tech industry right now, there's a reckoning that is happening. There's a massive amount of layoffs. Look at the big companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google, and look at their growth over the last 3 years during the time of COVID. I mean, they've added, I think one of them added 80,000 employees just in the last couple of years, right? So they do 10% or 20% layoff, they cut thousands of jobs, and they're still massively larger than they were in 2019, which is pretty crazy to think about. But the trend that I've been seeing, and certainly if you're someone who follows Elon Musk and you look at what he did with Twitter, whether you think that was positive or negative for the brand, I have no opinion on that. But certainly, I think we can all argue that Twitter as a company was a little bit fat. You know, they had many, many, many employees that probably weren't all essential. And that concept of corporate efficiency, I think, is probably one of the most important axes to live by when it comes to a successful company, at least certainly in this market, right? When everything was up and to the right, everybody was grow at all costs, spend, hire, do more, bring in your timelines, get to commercial viability faster. But there's an inefficiency that comes with that I think plagues companies as they grow. And it's very, very hard to maintain the momentum as you grow. And so we focused from the very beginning at Kodiak on high productivity, low burn, and high efficiency. And this is really born out of my observations coming from other companies. I was at the Google self-driving car project, and I saw it go from around 10 software engineers to, I think, 350 or 400 engineers 6 years later when I left. And the broader team was hundreds more than that. So we had become a much larger organization. And I literally watched the efficiency of the organization slow down in front of my eyes. And that was my first real industry experience with this. And then, of course, when I went to Auto, we were a small team again, started to make really rapid progress. It was exciting and fun. It was a breath of fresh air after coming from the Google team, now called Waymo. And I was like, okay, this is awesome. It was invigorating from a personal accomplishment perspective. And then we got acquired by Uber, and Uber ATG was a much larger organization. And the thing about these large organizations is they have really smart people. They have great people. When leaders and CEOs and companies say, yeah, our team, we have the best employees, we have the highest caliber software engineers, we have the most intelligence, et cetera, I actually don't think they're wrong. But what happens naturally is you add a lot of people to a given project, it becomes really, really hard to coordinate. And I know I'm sort of going off on a tangent here, but I think setting the context for where I was coming from when I started Kodiak and the experience that I had is incredibly important to the story. We have industry experts that make up our team. We have an incredibly experienced team that has been building these solutions for years and years and years. And we have the benefit not only of hyper efficiency, but also that we started at a much later point in the development cycle than some of these other companies did. And so that allowed us to take advantage of knowledge and experience that collectively we had learned over the last decade, and then employ that knowledge and experience in a very focused problem without allowing ourselves to get distracted, and really make progress that was equivalent, if not exceeding, much, much larger teams. And so that's really how we've been able to do it. It was the right place at the right time with the right people, but it was also the right philosophy that efficiency is the most important metric for a company. I still believe that, by the way. I believe that even in good times when investors were telling me, oh, you should be growing faster, you should be bringing in more capital. And yeah, it's easy to say that when times are good, but it certainly looks really bad when times are bad. And in this macroeconomic environment, you really want to be disciplined with your spend. And that's something that's always been in Kodiak's DNA from the beginning.
This just comes from your experience? Is there something deeper here? Because it sounds to me that you're a student of history, that you're understanding market cycles, and you're preparing Kodiak for, if you want to use the words of Jamie Dimon, an economic tsunami.
Well, first, I would say that running a company is hard. One of the things I've learned by founding Kodiak is that it's so multidimensional. It's a very complex operation, much more complicated than anybody really realizes at the surface level, including me. When I got into it, I'll be honest with you, I've had to learn a lot. And I can't say that I or our team has always made the right decisions as it pertains to product, technology, growth, team building, morale, motivation, inspiration. All those things are incredibly important to running a company. And it's very hard. It's hard for anyone. And I feel for leaders of companies who are struggling right now because I know how difficult it actually is. But ultimately, there's a lot of experience that goes into it. There's a lot of reading and knowledge, mentorship that plays a role. I can't speak for everyone, but certainly for me, having had those experiences at Google and then followed by Otto, going from a big company to a small company and then back to a big company. And I'll define Uber as a big company for the sake of this conversation. Having that juxtaposition in such a short period of time made it really obvious to me that hiring a bunch of people doesn't necessarily result in a good outcome, even when those people are really great. Because often if you put too many smart people in a room, they'll just try to talk over each other, and at the end of the day, nothing gets done. But if you have one really smart person in a room and they know exactly what they need to do, and you say, hey, you have one day, do it, and they just crank, you'd be amazed at what they can produce. And so that's really the philosophy that we came into this with. I mean, there's some other technical innovations that we made in terms of the way we do mapping, and it allows us to roll out a much larger network than some of our competitors have. And we made some key innovative technological breakthroughs that have really propelled Kodiak to the forefront. But at the end of the day, giving our experienced industry experts freedom to actually do the work, I think has been a big difference maker for us. And it wasn't a foregone conclusion, I'll be honest with you. I also didn't know for sure when we started Kodiak whether or not this was ultimately going to work out. And it's been a learning experience, and we've definitely changed things up along the way. But certainly now, here almost 5 years later, I can say that this was probably the right decision. And I think we're at least poised to be very successful in this space, and perhaps we're in a better position than most of the other companies that are working on this.
You're always learning. You're being extremely humble here. I want to add some context to this. How many employees does Kodiak have?
Right now, we have about 185 employees.
Say that again?
185.
You mean to tell me 185 employees enabled a Kodiak autonomous truck to go 5,600 miles round trip between Texas, California, and Florida?
That's right. And that includes all of our operations, technicians, truck drivers. That's the whole company.
You give people Wheaties? Is that what you give them? Wheaties? How are you doing?
Give them freedom to operate, right? Again, that's the key here is you set a vision. You get people who really believe in that vision. You set really challenging goals, but realistic goals. That was another thing that I think Kodiak really did right. And kudos to Andy, our CTO, who was one of our very first engineers to join the team. He's one of the first people I called after deciding to join Kodiak. Him and I got together in the very early days and said, we want to set challenging goals, but we want them to be realistic. And I think that's the sweet spot. Some leaders tend to over-challenge their teams in ways that are deflating in the end. And certain people, you think about Steve Jobs, you talk about Elon Musk, these people who demand impossible outcomes and then somehow miraculously they actually, they work out. I think there's a lot of lessons to take from that. Not everybody can be a Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. And so I think it's really important to find your own balance. But setting achievable but stretch goals is a really important part of a successful company, particularly in the early stages, but probably at all stages. And I think that's something that we did incredibly well. We were able to set milestones early on that were multi-years out for ourselves. And then 2-3 years later, lo and behold, we were actually able to hit those milestones either on time or ahead of time. right? And so that's really motivating when people see that that's possible, and that makes people want to work harder. And then again, you give them the freedom to do that, and then you don't allow them to get distracted, because great engineers, they want to do all the things, and you have to constantly remind the team about the mission and the focus and exactly what we're trying to do. Another strength that Kodiak has is that we're not trying to be all the things to all the people. If you look at some AV companies out there, they want to solve the ultimate in self-driving, which is all vehicles, all platforms, all places, everywhere, all the time. And as a technologist, I think that's awesome. As a researcher, I think that's awesome. I think that's a novel goal. I think that's the end state of our industry. I think that's where we want to see things go. But at the same time, as a business person, you have to realize you have to make money. And you have to come up with a product that actually sustains the company to do additional R&D, to do additional things. And that's, I think, the difference of how certain companies have approached this space. They've tried to solve all the things from day one. And when you do that, you end up solving none of the things. So at Kodiak, we've been focused on over-the-road long-haul trucking, autonomy. And that was our mission statement on day one. And that's still our mission for the company, almost 5 years in. And that focus and not allowing ourselves to get distracted, I think, has been a huge component of our success.
Another component of your success that I want to highlight for our listeners, you've never done a free delivery. You've never done a free run. You're getting paid for what you've done. You've done over 2,500 deliveries to date, and you're actively moving 1 million pounds of freight a week through 24/7 operations. I'm going to give a shout out to another founder in the industry, is Scott Hamnoram from Kodiak. They've never done a free run. Everything they do is paid, and we see the success that Kodiak's having with the middle mile. Why did you make the decision on day one, says, Kodiak's not a charity, we're a business, I'm going to stay disciplined and run this as a business?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First off, you want people in the industry to take you seriously. And if you want them to take you seriously, like trucking is a very mature space. It's one of the most mature industries. The logistics industry in general is incredibly mature. That's not to say that it's not evolving, it's not changing, it's not being disrupted. But when you talk to a trucking carrier, a trucking company, a fleet, their leadership has typically been at that company for 20 plus years, right? They've done this for a long time. And they're used to dealing with companies that are small margin. They're used to talking cost from the very beginning. And you want them to think of you as a serious player in the space. And so if you're going to be a serious provider of technology or a serious provider of a service, you're going to charge for that service, right? You're going to charge what it actually costs you to run that service. And at the end of the day, you need to make that service more valuable than the alternative. That's how business gets done, and that's the expectation within the industry. So we wanted to present ourselves as a serious player, and we also wanted, on the flip side, we wanted to be able to show our investors that, hey, people are willing to pay for this. Because one of the questions that everyone has, how do you monetize self-driving? Who's going to pay for it? Where's the value in the value chain? And that's something that we've been spending the last several years figuring out, particularly the last year. And honestly, we have not gotten much pushback. People don't really ask for freebies. And we're at the point now where we have so many partners and so many customers that we're actually turning people away. So companies are coming to us, and we're in a position where we can now throw a little bit more elbow around in terms of the terms that we ask for. But at the same time, we recognize that we can't build this by ourselves. Right? We're not a standalone company. We're a technology provider. We ultimately want to provide AV technology to the industry, to the carriers and fleets that are out there running freight day in and day out. And so we need them, they need us, and we want to build this future together. And when you go in with that message, the response is very positive.
You're a partner to the industry. The company's been around for 5 years. Let's go back 3 years, 4 years. What were some of those early meetings like with the shippers and the carriers and said, we're going to generate revenue. We're not a charity. Did some of the older individuals that have been there 20 years, 30 years said, you know what, Don, we respect you. You want to build a business. We want to be your partner. Is that what it was like?
I wouldn't quite say it was like that. I think if you're going back 3 years, 4 years, there was a lot of skepticism in the space. And shout out to Simple. They did a lot of good for the industry, I think, initially in developing and cultivating commercial partnerships earlier than most other AV companies were. Back in 2019, they were really at the forefront, and they are arguably ahead of the rest of the industry from that perspective. And so they set the tone and did a lot of the groundwork to educate folks on what AV means for their business. And we were coming in around the same time. And so a lot of the early conversations, some of them were met with skepticism, right? Hey, this will never happen. You'll never be able to pull this off. We're not really interested. And there was a handful of folks, Eric Fuller at US Express, who's been around the space for a very long time, as one example, and a great partner for Kodiak. He, to his credit, really sees the future and sees the potential of this technology in a way that I think a lot of other leaders in the space don't. You got to find the right partners. And we did, and we're very fortunate to be working with a great set of partners, folks like Werner Enterprises now. But I mean, if you fast forward to now, the skepticism in the space is significantly less. Now people have actually seen the technology with their own eyes. They've been able to ride in the trucks. We've now been able to deliver commercial freight day in and day out for a long period of time. And so a lot of the mystery around the technology is gone. And I think that helps people understand that this is real, it's coming. And now it's just a matter of how do we make it effective? How do we actually integrate deeply with these companies? There's a lot more than just making the self-driving truck work on the road. There's the integration with logistics, there's the transportation management systems, there's the coordination with the shippers and the bidding and the redistribution of the trucks to make sure they're where they need to be, when they need to be to pick up the loads. And those are all things that are not really manual processes at the scale that most of these companies run on. And so we need to make sure that our systems integrate in an automated fashion with the existing systems. And spoiler alert, most companies use different systems, which is somewhat annoying from our perspective. And this is why it's really important. I say annoying, that's just the way the industry works. That's why it's really important for us to find these key cornerstone partners that will allow us to really go deep with them in the early stages before the system is driverless and get it out on the road.
Is this where James Reed comes into the picture? You recently hired him as COO, former CEO of USA Truck, highly respected gentleman from Arkansas in the trucking industry. Is this where he comes into the picture?
Absolutely. This is an area where James really, really helps us to speak the language. James is a guy who I've gotten to know over the last several months and has been a fantastic addition to the team. Now he's just been here for a little while, and I can't imagine not having him on the team. He helps us out in so many ways, not only strategically thinking through how do we build the business, the commercialization plan, and he's a fantastic leader as well. He's been through so much, not only growing the team and righting the ship at USA Truck, but before that, he was at many other companies, both private and public. He's been at big tech companies. He spent many years at Intel, Dell EMC. And so he just has a lot of great perspective, both on the technical side, but also in the trucking space. So he speaks the language. He knows everyone. He's incredibly positive and forward-thinking. And so he's just been a great addition to the team. And I think he's really helped us think through a lot of the more nuanced challenges that we face in communicating, working with, and ultimately delivering a product for the big carriers out there.
I like James. He's a good guy. And I want to compare and contrast. If you look at the evolution of companies, Cruise, before Kyle came back as CEO, hired a wonderful gentleman. Gil, if you're listening, shout out to you, sir. Gil West, former COO of Delta Airlines, came in as COO of Cruise. And we've seen when Gil started at Cruise to where Cruise is today, the company's firing on all cylinders. It's not the same company since Gil came on board. And perhaps you can have the same thing with James, because Gil brought this incredible experience from Delta, and James is bringing this incredible experience from trucking. Not only did you hire James, you hired a gentleman named Gerhard Ischelbach. You hired him as chief security officer. So you hire a gentleman with deep trucking experience that's highly respected. You hire a gentleman who God knows how many secrets he knows from security world. Don, all signs are pointing to you're getting ready to really commercialize here.
Absolutely. There are different areas that we have to be prepared for when it comes to deploying this technology. Obviously, the technical one is probably the first one that comes to most people's minds, and it's absolutely true. We have to deliver on the tech It has to be rock solid. It has to be incredibly safe. It has to be incredibly efficient. And Andy, our CTO, has done a tremendous job leading the technical effort. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. Ultimately, you have to have the commercialization. You have to have security. And it's an area that more people are talking about these days, which I think is really good. And it's an area that we identified we certainly needed to be not only doing the minimum required, but we need to be leading the industry. And so we wanted to go out and find someone who was truly world-class when it comes to information security. And Gerhard is someone I've known for a long time. I've followed his career when he was at Google, and then he went to Aurora, and now he's at Kodiak. And I think bringing on folks like James and Gerhard really shows that we have the leadership team in place that we need to be a mature company. Dare I say, gearing up to be a public company someday. I'm not making any predictions as to when that'll come. It'll come when we're ready. But we're certainly putting the leadership team in place. And Gerhard is absolutely world-class when it comes to security. He commands the authority that you would expect from somebody who is going to ensure that these vehicles are safe and that our networks are safe. Because, yeah, you can think about the security of the truck at the endpoint, but you also have to make sure that the backbone of the company is secure as well. And we do a lot of computing on the cloud. We have a lot of infrastructure. We have communication with the vehicles. They communicate with each other and to the infrastructure. And so there's a lot of security both within the trucks, but also outside of the trucks that we need to think about. And I'm super excited to have Gerhard leading that effort.
Whether you decide to go public or not decide to go public, that's a decision for you and your board to make. One thing is pretty much a given here. At some point, Kodiak's going to do fully driverless operations. Are we getting close to fully driverless operations for Kodiak?
We are getting close. It's a really exciting time. And one thing that I would point to is when you look broadly at the space, I think there's now at least four companies that have actually put driverless vehicles on the public roads. You have Waymo, you have Cruise, who you just mentioned, who I think are both doing great on the robotaxi front. And just recently, Zoox announced that their vehicle has been approved and is now doing public road operations. I think Nuro also has vehicles that are driverless out there on public roads. So there's a lot of de-risking that has occurred from a technological perspective, right? Investors used to ask, is it even feasible? Is it even possible to build a safe autonomy system? And I think the answer is clearly yes now. And you've seen many, many proof points of that. Now, those programs got started much before most of the trucking industry took off. And so there's still a few years still to go on the trucking side. One of the advantages I think we have, though, is that there's a much bigger and better business to be built in trucking in the commercial space than what you see in robotaxi. And so we are a couple years away from driverless operations, but the good news is that we are working on the platform that we believe will be ready for driverless operations on public roads. So in terms of the hardware platform, in terms of the truck, in terms of the redundancy, thinking about the compute system, that is already in development for driverless operations. And we announced, I think, way back in either the end of 21 or early 22, I can't remember exactly, we announced our 4th generation truck. We're excited to announce our next generation truck, and we're already working on the one after that. So there's a lot of development on the redundancy, which is the last linchpin in the cycle that we need to solve in order to ensure that these systems are safe. So you're going to see that in the next couple of years, and then we're going to start to commercialize thereafter and start to scale.
When you focus on redundancy, is that redundant braking, redundant sensors, redundant compute? What does the redundancy look like? Are you basically building a truck within a truck?
It's all of the above. It's not a truck within a truck, but when you think about a human driving, if you lose your power steering, in most cars at least, you can still steer the car. It's a little bit more difficult, but you can just use brute strength to turn the vehicle. Same with the brakes. You typically don't have any redundancy on the throttle. If you lose your throttle, if you lose your gas pedal, then you're not going to be able to accelerate, but you can still come to a safe stop. So for a autonomous vehicle, you can imagine that there's nobody to override any mechanical system in the truck, right? This is driverless. There's nobody in the seat. So we have to have multiple electrical systems that control the safety critical devices like steering wheels and braking systems. So we've developed and are developing with partners, OEMs, tier 1 suppliers, redundant paths to control the underlying platform. So that's braking and that's steering, where you have redundant and separate actuators that can both do the job, and they're separately controlled by different control interfaces on different CAN buses, as it's called, the communication framework within the vehicles. But it goes beyond that. You said sensors. We do have redundant sensing, not just within a given modality like cameras or LiDAR. We do have redundancies there, but we have intermodal redundancy. So we have 360-degree field of view of all of our sensors, from the LiDAR to the cameras to the radar. And so we can check what we see in the camera view based on what the LiDAR sees. And we can check what the LiDAR sees based on the radar. And when you put that into a big machine learning system, you can have a lot of confidence with the redundancy in the sensor suite that we have, that we understand the world around us. And then, of course, there's the compute stack. One thing that most people don't think about is the power. You have to have redundant power for these systems because the computers ultimately need power to run. You get that from the alternator on the engine. You're going to have dual alternators. You're going to have dual power systems. If one power system fails, you want to have battery backups. If your batteries fail, you want to have a redundant battery backup. And so it goes all the way down the chain. We actually have an embedded compute system that we designed in-house. It's our own proprietary ECU, which we call the ACE, the Actuation Control Engine. And that's also redundant. So all of the decisions that are being made for the safety of the vehicle, what I call the safety envelope of the vehicle, we have a fully redundant system where they're constantly checking each other. And if one fails or if one goes out of limits, the other one can take over and safely pull the truck over to a safe stop. So the redundancy goes all the way up and down the stack, as we say, from the sensors to the compute, to the power, to the controller, to the platform, to the brakes, to the wheels, et cetera. And by the way, I will add that one thing we don't necessarily have redundancy over in the entire truck is our steering tires. So you talk about redundancy. We do have drive tires. They're redundant. We have multiple axles and we have multiple tires in each one. One of the questions we often get, and I know you didn't ask this, but I'll talk about it anyway, is what happens if you have a tire blow up? And that's something that we were able to show. I believe we were the first and still only AV trucking company to show controllability in a tire blowout scenario. So that was one of the big remaining non-redundant systems in the truck, and we showed that we actually respond 10 times faster than a human when it comes to handling a catastrophic steer tire blowout. You only have one tire steering the truck on either side of the vehicle. So if you lose one of those, you have to be able to maintain lateral control, and that's something that our system has proven that it can do. And so that was sort of one of the last steps of validation that we needed in the process.
You're creating a safer truck, so when my family goes down the highway and they're next to a Kodiak truck, they're in safe hands.
Absolutely. They should feel even safer driving next to a Kodiak truck than what you would feel next to a human, or at least that's what we're striving for. At the end of the day, we want people to feel incredibly safe knowing that they are driving next to a self-driving vehicle that isn't drunk, it's not drowsy, it hasn't been on the road tired for 11 plus hours. It isn't racing to get home after a long day's work. It's just in the right lane, going the speed limit, minding its own business, and it's not going to do anything erratic. It's just going to sit there, kind of cruise along. And typically these trucks are driving slower than you anyway. So you're not going to be next to a truck for long. You're just going to pass it on the left and never think twice about it.
Well said. Once the driverless operations begin, how do you see them scaling? Are we going to be in the Sun Belt that's historically there? Will you come to your home state, Florida, which is my state? How do you see them scaling?
Well, if you ask my parents, they want us to get to Florida faster than anything because I'm from Florida, as you mentioned. I think that you're definitely going to see a proliferation of this tech as it rolls out in the Sun Belt across I-10, I-20, I-40. Those are the major corridors that run across the United States. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, we have really good regulatory relationships with the states in the southern half of the United States. They've really set us up for success. And that's something that we've worked with the legislatures, the local DOTs, the highway patrol departments in all of the states. And that's something that is very important, obviously, as we look to deploy these in a driverless fashion. The next one is infrastructure. Most of the southern infrastructure is very well kept. The highways are in very good condition, and partly that's because They have good funding. Partly that's because they have good weather. And of course, weather is the last and most important one. We want to start, you have to start somewhere. You might as well start where the weather is more favorable. And the weather is more favorable in the South. That's why we set up shop in Dallas. That's where our base of operations is. And we've been scaling out from there ever since. One of the advantages that Kodiak has is that we actually operate all across the southern United States today. We're not just in Texas anymore. We're not just doing Dallas to Houston. We were the first company in Dallas. We were the first company driving Dallas to Houston. And now while other AV companies are starting those routes and focusing on those routes, we've moved beyond that. We've driven to Atlanta, as you said, down to Florida. We've driven coast to coast up to San Francisco and back. And we have various contracts with companies, some of which we've announced, some of which we haven't, that take us across the country on a day-to-day basis. And so you're going to see this, you're going to see it roll out in those areas first. Obviously, we start with 1 truck, then we move to 2, and then we move to 10, and it grows from there. And we're going to be starting to integrate with our partner fleets, hopefully in 2025.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I don't know the word to say it, but beautiful. As you roll out in, let's go, in the Sun Belt, what role will the law enforcement engagement that Brett on your team has built, does that play a big role in where you're going to go? So if you have a better relationship in, say, this area of Arizona, you'll operate driverless there, or region of Florida or Atlanta. What role does law enforcement play in where you first go driverless?
Well, we are super lucky to have Brett Fabry on our team. And he joined us last year. He's been great in helping us think through how we work with law enforcement and how we introduce our technology to the law enforcement community. That's been a really important piece of the story as we roll it out. Again, it's not just about the tech, but it's about the people who are affected by this, the people who have to understand the tech. And so he's been a tremendous advocate for us. And the response that we've gotten from Highway Patrol and law enforcement throughout the country has been incredibly positive. And in the fall, the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance announced the adoption of their new enhanced inspection program. So this is a program, if you're not familiar, if your audience is not familiar, trucks and trailers go through an inspection process before every run. The driver does a walk around. They're looking for the integrity of the tires, of the brakes, of the connections, the overall condition of the treads, of the trailer itself, the truck's condition, et cetera. And so the question is, how do you deal with that when there's no driver? Well, first answer is, when we launch our autonomous vehicles, we are going to have someone on the ground there. But ultimately, we need to ensure the integrity of these systems as they drive hundreds or even thousands of miles across the country. And so we have been on the forefront of this new enhanced inspection program. That's really a coalition effort that we've worked with other AV companies on, and really set a new inspection standard and procedures that are designed to govern the inspections of autonomous trucks. So that's something that we've been working with law enforcement on. We've made a lot of great progress, and we've been working hand in hand with them to make sure that the proper measures are in place for a safe deployment.
That comes down to leadership. You're at the forefront of this. You have a positive relationship with law enforcement, but I want to highlight, I think, the most important part of the conversation. You're a CEO, you're based in California, and you made a very, if you want to call it a hard decision, I think it was a beautiful decision. You made the strategic decision to work with the Department of Defense to help automate future U.S. Army ground vehicles, led by the Army's Robotic Combat Vehicle Program. Thank you for working with the military. Thank you for helping to save the lives of these men and women that keep us free. They don't get enough support, and they get beat up in the valley all the time. And you, as a CEO of a very prominent tech company, said, you know what? I love the military. I'm going to work with the military. Why did you make that decision?
Well, it's not as widely publicized, but we've actually been interested in working with the DoD for quite some time. We started with an exploratory project with the U.S. Air Force a couple of years ago, where we developed a software stack and simulation for autonomous flight line vehicles at the Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. And basically, the flight line is everything in and around the Air Force Base, the bases that exist all over the world, not just here in the United States. And they move a lot of goods, and they move a lot of people, and they move a lot of things constantly from point A to point B in these bases. And they call that the flight line. And so they're very interested in automating that process. And so we kicked off a project with them to show how our technology works in that environment. And ultimately, we feel like this is an application, or rather DoD usage in general is an application that deserves really robust, really safe autonomy, like you said, to keep men and women out of harm's way. And so we've been looking ever since that project for other opportunities to utilize the technology that we've developed in a way that can be helpful to the U.S. military. And so when we came across the DIU project last year, we were really excited because we felt like it wasn't a huge departure from the technology that we built. One of the things that we have implemented on the commercial side is something called sparse mapping technology. So rather than high definition detailed maps of the environment that our trucks rely on to drive safely, we perceive the environment in real time much the way a human does. And what that allows us to do is to be a little bit more flexible in terms of the structure of the environment. And so when you get to construction zones and areas that are a little bit less structured, our approach gives more flexibility in those cases. But it turns out that the U.S. Army also is very interested in unstructured autonomous driving on off-road or partially developed road environments. And so we thought that we could apply our technology to that application. And we ended up applying through a DIU program, Defense Innovation Unit. In the fall of last year, there were 33 companies that applied for that contract. And ultimately, we were the ones that were awarded the contract. We think it's huge validation for the company. And we're really proud to be working with the U.S. Army and the DoD. And we're looking for other opportunities to deploy our technology in a useful and beneficial way to help save lives.
You're doing good, and I'm going to quote you here from a statement you made around the contract. You stated, "I started Kodiak because I believe autonomous technology can save lives, and helping the U.S. Army develop driverless vehicles for the most challenging operating environments fits perfectly with that goal. We are proud to have the opportunity to leverage our cutting-edge self-driving technology for defense applications, and believe our work with DIU and the United States Army will both help strengthen national security and hasten our path to commercial development. We owe a debt of gratitude to the servicemen and women who step into harm's way to keep us safe. Keeping them safe in return is an honor we take seriously." Well said.
Yeah, thank you.
Well said. You care. You're a CEO who cares. You're respecting the military. And if we look at markets, military contractors are a healthy business to be in. If this scales and proves to be a success and the men and women are safer in combat or in theater, if you want to use that term, will you scale up a military contractor division at some point?
One thing I think people don't often realize is that most folks who have been working in self-driving for a long time, let's say 15 plus years like myself, we all got into it from an academic perspective based around safety. It wasn't an industry thing back in the mid-2000s when DARPA was running their grand and urban challenges. It was a bunch of researchers and professors who basically were working off of government grants to do research in this area to hopefully develop technologies that would lead to fundamental safety improvements for our roadways and help save lives. So it's always been at the core of what I've done and what I've been interested in. It's why I got into self-driving. And so I've always been looking for opportunities to apply the technology to safety applications. Obviously, I believe that there's opportunity in the commercial space to build a great business, and that's an important piece of deploying technology. You have to build a business. You can't sustain any type of safety technology if you can't also make money. They come hand in hand. But at the same time, we felt like it was a great opportunity for us to apply that technology to additional safety critical situations in and around national security and work with the DoD. So yeah, it's a real honor to be able to do that. And absolutely, we do plan to look for other opportunities. We want to be very strategic about this. I don't want anybody to think of Kodiak as a military contract company, because we are keeping a heavy focus on our commercial development and our commercial deployment. But the truth be told, there's a lot of uncertainty in that space, right? It's a very hard problem to solve. Nobody's really cracked the code. And while I believe that we have all the pieces required to make it happen, and I'm very confident that we're going to get there, in investors' eyes, there's still a lot of uncertainty. And we're making inroads there and chipping away at that every day that goes by. But working with the DoD is an opportunity for us to bring additional revenue into the company, bring that revenue forward and do work for a good cause at the same time. And so for us, it's a win-win. We get a application that we really believe in that also brings in revenue for the company, which de-risks the investment in the company, which allows us to raise more capital to fund our commercial efforts and ultimately be successful. So it all sort of fits together, and it's something that we're really proud of. And again, the strategic nature of how to run a successful business in the current market will always continue to evolve, but I think we're taking very prudent steps.
You're running a business. Don Burnette, CEO of Kodiak, runs a business. He focuses on revenue. He focuses on the shareholders. That's why you want to partner or go into business with Kodiak, because Don runs a business. Don, putting this whole conversation together, what is the future of the autonomous trucking industry, and what role do you want Kodiak to play?
I think is incredibly promising, right? As we gain wider attention, we're going to see improved safety, we're going to see improved efficiency, and we're going to be able to reduce operating costs of this industry. I think one other area that I'm really excited about is the resiliency in the supply chain. So when you think about the last couple of years, especially during COVID, it really opened people's eyes to the fragile nature of our supply chain. And not all of it was due to trucking, but some of it was absolutely due to trucking, not to any one particular person or entity's fault, but just as an industry as a whole, we can really increase the resiliency of the supply chain, which affects each and every person. So I think the future is very bright. I think people are going to really love this technology once it's ultimately on the roads. It's going to make the roads safer, and it's going to bring down costs of everyday products. It's going to reduce traffic, help the environment, and there's a whole host of other benefits. So I'm as bullish as I've ever been, and it's been a long road, I have to say. There's been a lot of ups and downs, but where I sit today, I think we're in a great position to capture this market and really make a difference.
From what we heard today, you're definitely in a position to capture that market. And I've said this many times on this podcast, autonomous trucking will help to lower inflation, as we're seeing what's happening with the CPI report. This bout of inflation is sticky. Chairman Powell and the Fed, they've got their work cut out for them to get this inflation down, but I know in my heart of hearts, and the data will prove it, autonomous trucking can help to lower inflation. And that's what Don, the team, and Kodiak, and the entire industry is trying to do. And Don, as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
The message I always like to leave people with is that this technology is a lot closer than people realize. I want your listeners to start thinking about this having a real impact in the everyday world. This is obviously just the beginning, but we are delivering over 1 million pounds of freight every week with our technology. And while we have a safety driver in the seat, we're really modeling our commercial efforts today in exactly the same way that they would be operationalized once the system is driverless. And so once we get through building that platform for redundancy, doing the validation on the software, we will be able to pull the driver. There's plenty of existence proofs for that. It's no longer a question of if, it's just a question of when. And we're really going to make a difference in this market. So it's closer than people realize, and progress is being made every day.
The tech is here. The tech is real. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is Kodiak. Don, thank you so much for coming on the road to autonomy today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great time.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed in this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.